herding sheep, and if you've ever tried to herd sheep, it can be challenging. But their whole life was focused on protecting those sheep and caring for those sheep. But they weren't considered very skillful or very important. So that makes it even more remarkable that God chose these shepherds to receive a glorious message. The story of the shepherds.
The hundreds of sheep were quiet now, except for an occasional bleat. Night had fallen, stars were sharp in the nippy sky, and shepherds reclined on a steep hillside above Bethlehem watching their flocks. The shepherds talked quietly, their low voices soothing to the animals. Old Elias had spent his lifetime on these sheep fields. Another shepherd was Ruth, 20 years old and cynical. Her uncle had been imprisoned by Roman occupation troops for some minor offense. And when she could, Ruth plotted secretly with a unit of zealot guerrillas. Ruth thought of David, Israel's greatest king, who had been a shepherd on Bethlehem's hills a millennium before. As a teenager, David had defeated the giant Goliath and thrown off the yoke of the Philistine tyranny. Ruth longed to do the same. If only a leader, a deliverer, could come and drive those cursed Romans from their land.
The lambs will all die before long. Only the ewes will survive.
Hey!
Elias said a bit too loudly. His hearing had faded over the years. Ruth spoke a bit louder.
The ewes will be sheared next summer and bear more lambs, but the lambs themselves...
What?
The lambs!
Said Ruth loudly into his ear.
Won't live past Passover in the Jerusalem temple. They'll be sacrificed.
Ah, Passover in the temple. On the holy day, they'll sacrifice a lamb for each family.
Jerusalem and its temple were just 6 miles north of Bethlehem, and supplying lambs for the Passover sacrifice was these shepherds' livelihood.
Passover. I wish I could have seen the first Passover.
Now, Elias would rather talk than listen, since it was hard for him to catch the words when others spoke.
Moses was our deliverer on that first Passover night when God's judgment fell on Egypt.
As he spoke, his listeners could picture the destroying angel that had passed through Egypt.
The Egyptian firstborn were killed, but each Israelite slave family had sacrificed a precious lamb and put its blood on the top and both sides of their doorways. Their sins were atoned for, the lamb's life for theirs, and God's terrible judgment passed over them.
The ewes will live on, but the lambs will be sacrificed.
What?
said Elias. But Ruth didn't say it again.
I don't think I'd like to be a lamb.
The shepherds now fell silent and tugged their heavy cloaks about them to shelter them from the whistling wind. Their eyes were accustomed to the blackness. Every few moments, they would scan the hills for wolves and thieves. They weren't about to lose sheep to carelessness. Sudden, their hillside was flooded by the light like 1,000 arc lamps, blinding them with its intensity. When they could finally see, a man in shining apparel stood before them.
"Do not be afraid.
He declared in the ringing voice of a herald.
I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a deliverer has been born to you. He is the Lord's Messiah."
The Messiah, the deliverer, he has come at last to set our people free.
Scarcely comprehend. Good news, great joy. In the town of David, the son of David is born this night, the Lord's Messiah, the shining man, glowing with the very Shekinah glory of God had declared it. It must be so.
This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger.
What a strange sign. But there was no time to think. Now the shining angel drew himself to full height, and as he opened out his arms, the radiance and glory upon him began to spread until they covered rank after rank of angels. The heavenly host, more and more, began to fill the sky. And now they began to chant, to shout in unison, "Glory to God in the highest."
The sound bounced off the hills and echoed from the valleys, like the rumble of thunder, like the roar of a great waterfall. The shout of triumph reverberated, the shout of worship, the shout of honor, the shout of glorious praise.
Glory to God in the highest.
They shouted together with one enormous voice of worship.
Glory to God in the highest.
They chanted in unison, the overwhelming resonance blotting out everything else and infecting shepherds with its utter joy. The host of God, overcome with awe at the archangel's words, now shouted again,
Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, shalom, peace to those whom God has favored.
Again and again, the waves of praise rolled over the hillsides until finally the voices began to fade, and only in the distance could the shepherds still hear shouts of glory, 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 that finally diminished to silence at last. The brilliant light, too, was fading, like the final streaks of sunlight dipping below the horizon and painting the clouds red and pink in departing splendor.
Praise the Lord, our dear friends. We have witnessed what the prophets only dreamed of.
Angels.
The host of God's saints.
Something greater still. The chance to see the Lord's Messiah with our own eyes. You heard the angel. He's here, yonder, in Bethlehem, and we must find him. The angel told us how. A baby wrapped in the swaddling bands of a newborn, lying in a manger. A manger!
You could find dozens of cattle troughs if you searched all the outlying farms, but a manger with a newborn lying in it, that was the sign. In Bethlehem itself, Elias could think of just one inside a cave at the very edge of town where travelers' animals were quartered. The old man careened down the hillside at a pace that left the younger shepherds breathless. He was ahead of them now, almost running to the cave behind the inn. And when they finally caught up, the old man was standing at the doorway to the cave, tears running down his cheeks.
The Son of David, the Lord's Messiah, the Deliverer has come.
The shepherds moved inside and knelt at the manger, peering at that sleeping baby boy, all tightly wrapped in swaddling bands. The youngest explained to his mother.
An angel told us, then thousands, millions of angels filled the sky, lit up with God's light. Glory to God, they shouted, and we joined them until we were hoarse, until they were gone.
Young woman, mother of this blessed child, you are one of the favored ones of whom the angels spoke, upon whom God's glory and grace is resting tonight.
You could see her lips form the words, yes, I know, but no voice came.
The angel told us that your child is God's promised Messiah, our deliverer.
Then the old man was silent. He just knelt there for a few more moments. Finally, he rose up, took the mother's hand, and pressed it with his own.
God has entrusted you to raise his own son, my dear. Our prayers are with you.
He motioned his compatriots toward the door. And they got up, leaving the cave and its manger and its Christ child. Nor were the shepherds silent about what they had seen. They spread the good news far and wide. And then they went back to their flocks, carefully tended lambs that were destined for sacrifice on Passover. And though they could not know or even understand it, the baby in the manger would not challenge the Roman oppressors, but instead deliver us from sin and death that oppress us all. For those lamb herders had seen God's lamb born to be a Passover sacrifice for the sins of the entire world.
Glory to God in the highest.
And on earth peace, shalom for us all.